Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 82 of my modded Factorio playthrough. In this episode, we are going to talk about the circuit network and the logic used to turn on and off all of the various ore sorting methods. Enjoy! Well, now it's time to go over that blueprint I showed earlier. All of this craziness. And it might have to be changed a little bit to line up here, but doesn't matter. Well, let's modify the blueprint, remove those belts right there. And let's put it right here. We'll have to slowly place all of these components, and then I will explain what all of it does. Okay, that should be all of it. It's kind of a bit of a mess here, but we can remove some of this just to make it a little easier to look at. So it's kind of difficult to follow what this does, especially this part up here, in part because I built this in the other orientation. Instead of going up, I built it going down. So following what this part does up here might be a little easier. If I just select this part, flip it the other way, and just kind of plop it over there. Okay, let's get that placed. And just as a quick check to the work, this should be basically tileable here. Pretty much. That's kind of as I designed. Now, the certain elements of it aren't lined up, but it would work. Where we just place these down here, and it would be a giant mess of everything. So let's go through all of this. Well, at the start here, let's say this warehouse here is the storage warehouse for whatever resource we're trying to hold. So in the beginning here, we are producing iron. So iron is the thing that needs to get stored. So iron can be produced at any point after this for this system to work properly. And this is the logic that controls how the warehouse sends its signal. And it's kind of difficult to follow the wires because when I built it, it was in the other orientation, which makes it a little easier to follow the wires here. So just imagine this is the same thing. And let's throw something in there to pretend it's resources. And I don't know. Let's just say the resource is wood. Who knows? So you put the wood in there. What this whole thing does here is it generates a signal. This is basically a test signal generator, so we can kind of monitor and control how the system works without having to actually place resources into the warehouse. It's not strictly necessary for this setup to work, but it can be useful. Let me kind of show you just how it operates, and then we can go through all of the wires. And it's got a high level alarm lamp here, and a high level alarm speaker as well. And that's set up for iron. So for this to work correctly, we're going to need to change all this to wood. I think so. So it's all set up. So it's working normally. This is the output wire right here. You can see it says we have 10 wood, which is what we have in the warehouse. And then the logic all the way down here will receive that wood signal and determine when to turn on and off these belts. But let's say we wanted to check how things worked, and we wanted to control what this signal actually is. Well, we can use this signal generator here, and let's just say we wanted to test it with 18,000 wood. We select 18,000. And hit on. And now the output is 18,000 wood, even though we only have 10 wood. So how does that work? Well, let's follow the lines. Well, first, the signal for the quantity of resource that we have goes on this power pole and then is distributed to all three of these combinators here along the red wire. And then on this green wire here, distributed to these two combinators, is the number we actually want. What do we want the final signal to be? In this case, it's 18,000. So let's follow the path here. We have the arithmetic combinator up here that receives the amount of signal that we want, and it subtracts the signal that we have. So all that's left is the difference between the two signals, which it sends to this combinator along this green wire. So then it takes the amount of wood that we have and it adds it to the difference between the two and then outputs it as wood. And then that output is 18,000. Now our number is fairly small, so it's difficult to tell the difference. So let's make the requested number much smaller as well. We have 10. Let's say we just wanted 50. So we have 50 output. So we have our 10 wood input, and here we have our 50 for the number that we want. What this does is takes the 50, subtracts the 10, and all that's left is 40. And then that 40 is an input signal here. So it takes what's in the warehouse, the 10, adds it to 40, and gives us our output of 50. And this separates both sides from the warehouse. Now we can't just have a signal, a constant combinator here and say, oh, we want 50 wood, because the problem is if we connect them along the same circuit network, it's going to add 50 to 10, and we're actually going to have 60. So what this does is allows you to set a very specific number and then walk away. And then no matter how much is in the warehouse, it's always going to output just that 50. So let's say we wanted the output signal to be 5. Well, we set that and it works, because the output is now a negative number, and then it adds the negative number to the positive number and gives us our 5. So what's this combinator down here doing? Well, it's to allow the system to work if it's turned off. So let's say we don't care. We don't want to adjust the number. We just want it to be a pass-through. We want the actual number to go through. Well, what this does is it looks to see if A, which is the signal we're using for our desired output number, if it's 0, then just output the input count. So it has 10 going in, and then it sends the 10 as an output. And the other path doesn't affect the numbers because it's looking at the desired number, which is 0, subtracting what we have, which is 10, which gives us an output of negative 10. And then it takes what we have of 10, adding the negative 10, and then the output is 0, so it makes no change to the actual number. It's basically a bypass. And then this signal right here can be distributed to wherever we want. However, it also gets looped back here to this light and this speaker. Now the reason why it's being looped back is because the actual capacity of the warehouse is on an entirely separate network after all of this, because if these two sides were connected, it would create a loop and the numbers wouldn't work. So unfortunately, we can't just run a cable between these 2 points. I mean, we can and it would work, but the whole point of this is that we can test these alarms without actually having anything in the warehouse at all. So thus this demonstration could actually work. So we have a combinator down here. It just sends out a red square signal. And that red square signal is used by this lamp just to turn red by using use colors here. So these two need to be set to whatever number you decide is the high level alarm. I use the obligatory number of 90,000. Is that the actual number we'll use? Probably more like 90% as opposed to 90,000. So how much can a warehouse actually hold? Well, it holds 512 stacks. And each stack is 200. Oh, alright, so maybe I did calculate it. So a warehouse can hold about 100,000 items. So 90,000 is about 90% of what this can hold. So that's a good high-level alarm. So if we have more than 90,000, it'll turn on and just be red to make it easier to see. However, so we know the factory's backing up, I have a programmable speaker here as well. Set the volume to maximum and global playback, so no matter where we are on the map, we'll be able to hear it. And show alert, we'll put in a little alert right here that we can see. And then we just decide what we want. So if wood is more than 90%, when they have all these sounds we can play, and then the alarm, and also the GUI will say the wood warehouse is above 90%, and show icon on the map. So if I come in here and say, let's test the system if we have 95,000 wood, what happens? The alarm goes off. And I will turn that down, since now you know that it works. I mean, I could leave it on, but just pretend that no matter where we are in the factory, that noise is going to be going off. So we can silence it, so you know that it's going. But we have our GUI, wood warehouse is above 90%, and it's flashing down there. We can also hover over it if we want to see the text, but don't really need the text, just seeing the flashing icon tells me enough. Or if we go on the map, it's also flashing right here as well, which makes it's kind of hard to see, but it is another element. And the light is red to make it also easier to see. Now the reason why there's an alarm here is because we can't have these warehouses filling up completely. So if you look at all of these different sorting methods are producing, well, these ones in the beginning aren't, but some of these further down are producing multiple types of resources. So what happens if we fill up on copper and we want tin? Well, we don't get tin because copper's filled up, and it's even worse than that because if this is clogged up because this warehouse is full, all of these belts will be full, and then this will be full, and then literally the entire bus will stop moving. So if we fill up on one resource, the entire bus will stop. At least anything that comes before that full resource. On this direction, it would probably work a little better, but we definitely don't want to fill up any buffers with these resources. It's very important that they not fill up. So that is why I have this light and annoying alarm, so we can be alerted immediately to the problem. Because right now, we have no idea what's happening with the bus here. Like, are the belts full or empty? I don't know. You actually have to go in to look, and as the factory gets bigger and bigger, that gets harder and harder to actually do. And it looks like things are pretty stable at this point, so we probably can do some new research soon. But as the factory gets bigger and more complicated, we're going to want to have some automated systems to warn us of problems, so we don't have to keep, looking around on the map looking for problems. So that's kind of what this is designed to do. And if that sound is too annoying for you, you can use this one. But you can go through all these sounds. Whatever junk you want to use will work just fine. So, you turn that off, and the alarm goes away. So that's kind of why I have this system here, is so we can manually check things like this without actually having to have resources in there. Okay, now that we've covered this, just flip it around upside down, and that's what's right here. And it's been set up for operating with iron. So if we come in here to the combinator and say, I want 95,000 on the iron signal. We turn it on, and we have the alert for iron. Even though there's no iron in there at all, it's generating the signal. And we turn it off, it passes the signal through. Okay, so why did I start by explaining how this warehouse works? Well, we have to go and follow the electrical signal here. And let's generate a signal, just so we can kind of follow it along. Let's say... let's just say 2000. So we want a 2000 signal. So we hit that, and now we're generating 2000 iron. And we'll follow the signal down to right here. And then that signal gets passed through every single one of these 16 combinators. And let's see, I could change this a little bit. Just to make it lined up. There we go. That should work. So it's taking that red wire and it's sending it along the input of all of these combinators. So what are they all deciding? Well, you can sort them into two pairs. One is this red wire pair that gets put up on this pole, and then it gets sent down to control this belt on the left. And then the green wire pair goes up to the pole and controls this belt on the side. Now, we don't need to have these separated when we're only producing one resource. So instead of imagining this setup will exist for mineral catalyst production, which it won't, this will actually be much simpler when it's set up properly. Let's imagine this setup was in place much further down here. Let's imagine it was in place for something like rubite, where 4 rubite go in and we get a slag, 2 lead, and a nickel. Well, what these signals are doing are determining the stop and start signals for the left and the right belts. So let's just do the right belt here. And let's follow this down the line. Well, these first 4 are the start signals, and the last 4 are the stop signals. So how does it work? Let's see, I have nickel, silicon, copper, and iron. So it was probably set up based on something. Yes. So I set that up for sapphirite chunk sorting. So let's just change this to sapphirite and say, let's say we have mixed belts of sapphirite coming through here. Sapphirite sorting output. How does that work? Well, you need to have a priority for how each resource turns on and turns off. And I'll go through that in a little bit. But let's say I determined that I want sapphirite sorting to produce iron if iron is less than 12,000. If it is, it sends a green start signal. Just one. And then I determined if copper is less than 4,000, I want to produce copper using this method. So send a green start signal. And then if silicon is less than 2,000, send the start signal. And if nickel is less than 2,000, send a start signal. So any one of those 4 conditions will send a green signal to start this up. And that's kind of how this mixed sorting works, is that you have no idea about how much each one of these are going to actually be used at any given time. It's just, what do you need right now? So I determined that, you know, if we're under 12,000, which is a fairly high number, we want to produce iron using this method. But it's not a very good method for making nickel, so I'm willing to wait for nickel to go all the way down to 2,000 before it's produced using this method. So if we need any one of those 4 resources, and the numbers line up, it will send a green start signal. And we can hover over the pole to see that the green signal has 4 green squares, because none of these are true. So as a result, it's 4 green squares being sent. And this belt up here will be turned on as long as we have 1 green square. We only need 1 condition to be active for it to turn on. So it's turned on. Well, now that we know that this is set to 12,000, let's say we have 15,000 iron. What happens then? We have 15,000 iron signal coming through. And you can see that now we only have 3 green squares on the green line. Now, both of these are identicals. That's why the both green and red signals are operating in the same way. Under normal conditions, these would be set differently. What that means is that although we have enough iron, we don't have enough copper, silicon, or nickel, so we're still getting 3 green signals, which means that this belt still stays on. Only once all 4 of those conditions are green, and we can just emulate this by saying equal to 1, it will turn off and stop the production of everything that's behind it. And these other 4 here are the stop signals. Now, we definitely don't want any of these warehouses to fill up. So how do we stop that from happening? Well, each one of these is set, so if iron is more than 80%, or 80,000, send a red square. That exists for iron, for copper, for silicon, and for nickel. So what this means is as long as you have less than 80,000 of any of the byproducts, you can keep running this setup. But once one of those warehouses is full, you have to stop producing the resource using this method. So the way to think of this is, let's say we wanted iron, and we're producing iron. But copper is a byproduct. Well, that's fine. We can keep producing iron this way until we can't. So what happens when the iron warehouse gets to 80%? This will send a red square signal. And the way the red square signal works is that there could be no red square signals at all for this to be enabled. Because if we have 1, it will turn off. So when you have different methods of producing resources, different combinations of combinators, and different sets of logic can turn on and off each one of these organically. And it's very difficult to think in the big picture because so much is happening all at once that it's really important to have a set of logic to control all of this. But one last thing we can do is test what happens if we have more than 80,000 of something. So let's say we have 85,000 iron. It's not high enough to trigger the alarm, but it is high enough to turn off the production of anything that's filling it up. So basically, if we were full on something, like let's say iron, then every single iron producing process, even if it's a byproduct or it's a main product or whatever, every single one turns off. So basically the factory will stop producing iron until we've gotten rid of that backup and it can start running again. It's kind of the whole point of these warehouses is they're a very large buffer to allow the factory to bend towards the current resource production needs. To a point. It'll only work to a point. Like if you don't have some kind of logic set up, you're just going to be completely overloaded resources and it's going to get nuts. So you definitely want to have something in place to handle all of this. So let's follow this down the line. Let's say that everything's being produced properly and it goes through, well, the 2 output belts. First thing that happens is it gets the slag pulled off of the belts, if it exists at all. So obviously making iron through catalyst will not produce any slag, so that won't be necessary for this setup. But if we were producing it through sapphirite, we would be producing slag. So this is the most complicated version of this setup. Like we can chop off a lot of this stuff for various locations here, but this is the completed setup. So let's assume there's slag. Well, first the slag gets pulled off. So it gets pulled off the belt on the left here, gets pulled off on the belt on the right here. And then the output of those 2 belts goes to here and is combined into a single belt and placed in this storehouse. It's a storehouse with 1 square open. So I'm not using this to store anything. I'm essentially turning this into a 4 to 3 balancer that works basically perfectly at full throttle without having a bunch of crazy belt stuff. It's kind of one of the cheaty but very useful applications of loaders. And on this side, you can see there's also 3 belts coming through of more slag. And the reason why there's 3 there is because if you look at our prediction here, if we're running every single method of ore sorting that is inefficient and produces slag, we will produce 75 slag per second at most. which is 2.5 red belts, or let's just say 3. So that's why this is set up in such a way. So slag will go down the bus, and every time more slag is available, it will keep getting placed on, and it will go to the left here somewhere. Similarly to what we were doing with our other byproducts of geodes and crushed stone, because all of those need to be processed. So for now, we just need to send it away. And sending it right is bad because there's water there. So we're sending it left. Then the next thing that happens, after it does some undergrounds here, is it goes into the next set of splitters, which is the bypass splitters. What they're doing is preventing us from sending resources through this splitter, or through this nastiness right here, just to go right back into the warehouse, and that would add congestion to the series of belts here. So basically it's just bypassing. So if iron is the thing that we want and it was being produced here, it's just saying skip all that, go through these undergrounds, and go straight into the warehouse without going through all of this. So slag is taken out, iron is taken out, so now we have copper, silicon, and nickel left on these 2 belts. What happens is those 2 belts are split into 8, and then they go through this balancer, and since this balancer is also set to grab iron, nothing that's left over will go through those, so they will just pass through. So basically what it's doing is the leftover resources will come in here, get placed down here, through this underground, and then on this belt here. This one comes up, goes in this splitter, down there, and then through there. So then this splitter goes through there, that splitter goes through there. And then the other half go in the other direction. So it goes up, down through there, up, down through there, down through there, down through there. And this will give us an output of 8 belts. So it's not quite the 9.5 that I calculated earlier, but 8 is a even number and convenient to use. So I'm going with 8. Plus, a lot of resources aren't ever going to go on the bus to begin with. They're going to get bypassed like this. So 8 sounds like a pretty reasonable number as far as the number of belts that we would need. And this can be expanded. You can see there's no reason why it has to be 8 other than using this method here. So 8 can work. So let's calculate from the other direction. So what happens with these 8 belts coming through here? Well, anything that came before this step will be on the bus here. And let's follow the bottom one. It goes undergrounded here, then undergrounded again, and then it goes through the splitter. Anything that's not iron stays on the bus. But anything that is iron is pulled off the bus up through here. So that works through this one, and through this one. And then those 4 belts are compressed into whatever you want them to be. This is a bottleneck, so 1 belt here may work just fine. But the problem is you're taking the output of 4 belts and compressing them into 2 or even 1. So it depends on how much iron is on those 4 belts. If you only had 1 belt's worth of iron on 4 belts, then that's fine, it'll squish into 1 just fine. But what happens if you had 2 belts of iron or 3 belts of iron on those 4 belts? Well, then there's going to be a backup. So there is a limit to how much this can pull off. But one advantage is I have tested it, and it does work at full flow. It's got a separate belt and a separate balancer for every single belt that comes through. So it does work very well at full power. The limiting factor really is how quickly can you pull it off once it grabs it. Because this can pull off 8 belts worth of product. You know, it can take 8 belts, pretend like it's filtering it, but then take all 8 belts and shoot them up through here. It's just, this is only 6 squares wide, not 8, so I figured 4 ought to work. And then whatever's left over, that's not iron, will keep going down the bus to get sorted. Now, this is completely unnecessary because this is the very last step in the iron production. So the only thing that will be left over will be iron at this point. But we probably will want to have some kind of warehouse at the end here to capture anything, because what happens if something gets placed on the bus that isn't an ore and all? Like, let's say some steel gear wheels found their way onto the bus. what happens then? Well, they're going to make their way to the very end here. And if this keeps happening, eventually this is all going to clog up. All this junk that's not ore is going to clog up. And who knows how that might happen, but, you know, you might forget something. We'll want to have a catch there. Hopefully that's all the gear wheels. I don't want some gear wheels just sitting around somewhere. And that's basically how that setup works. So before we build and place all of these, we need to figure out what the ore sorting logic actually is. And the logic that's being used is the status of the warehouse, or the signal that we're generating from the warehouse. It's how much ore will turn on or off this particular machine. And similar to how we did our carbon, we have 3 different ways of producing carbon, and then we have logic to determine which one is preferred. So let's say you have 3 different methods of producing something, and you want to control which one turns on and which one turns off in different conditions. We can kind of visualize that a little bit here with these belts. We can use our signal generator to do it. Let's say the least ideal method is this bottom belt. So let's say we only want this bottom belt to run if iron ore is very low. And let's say 2000 is very low. Then it turns on. Let's say this next one is slightly more desirable method of producing iron. So let's say only if iron is below 4000, turn on. And then this one up here, let's say this is our most desirable method. So let's say 6000 iron, turn on. Well, how does this work? Well, if we have no iron, or very little iron, let's say we've got 500 iron. You've got to turn it on. 500 iron. Well, that is below all 3. So 500 is very low. So what this means is every method of producing iron will turn on because it's an emergency. We don't care how bad of a method it is. We're low. We need it. So everything turns on. So let's say the level goes up to 3000. So we've been producing some iron. We're building up a little bit of surplus. So now we've got 3000 iron. What happens? Well, the least desired method was set to 2000, so it has turned off. So it's not as much of an emergency anymore. We can turn off the worst method, but we're still low. So the other 2 methods are still running. So let's say we're now up to 5000 iron. What happens? Well, being as this middle method was set to 4000, it has turned off. So now that we have a surplus of iron and a little bit of a buffer, the only method that's turned on is the most ideal method, because our factory is running just fine, so we might as well run it the way we want it to run. And let's say the factory keeps filling up, and let's say we're up to 6010. Well, it sends that signal down, and now the most efficient method is turned off because we have reached the set point of 6000. So now we're good on iron, and we don't need to be producing iron anymore, so any method that produces iron, turn off. So what that means is that these squares represent different processing lines down the bus here. So let's say this one was set to, say this is set to 12,000. What if this one was set to 12,000 as well? And it's running. So that's kind of how that works, is each one of these represents just one combinator in this group right here. So for this to work, we need to determine the priority of each method of production. And the way that it works is the least desirable methods have the lowest numbers, and the most desirable methods have the highest numbers. But to make things a little simple, let's just count up from now. So let's just say our least desirable method is 1, and we'll keep going up from there, and the most desirable method is whatever number ends up the highest. I will just calculate iron for this method here. But you'll have to do this for every resource that you produce. So we have lots of methods that produce iron. But what is the least desirable method of making iron? It's probably crotinium chunks sorting here, because we are only producing 1 iron out of every 6 inputs. So we have 5 byproducts for only 1 iron. That's pretty darn bad. We can also do stereotype chunks, which is also 1 iron for every 6 input ores, which is also really bad. But the thing that makes these different is that stereotype produces a little bit of silver, and silver is a rare resource, where crotinium produces aluminum, which is still rare, but less rare than the silver is. So that makes crotinium worse. So we'll make crotinium our worst production method. Let's just call it 1. And then stereotype is our second worst one, so we can call it 2. Well, going up from there, so we have iron from crushed crotinium. That produces 1 iron out of every 4 inputs, which is pretty bad. And the exact same thing for crushed stereotype as well. But crotinium is a rarer resource than stereotype is, so that makes sorting from crushed crotinium slightly worse. So that'll make this our number 3 production method, and then crushed stereotype be the number 4 production method. And then the next one up the line is iron from givelite chunks, because we get 2 iron out of every 6 inputs. This is also the case for sapphirite chunks as well, where we get 2 iron for every 6 inputs. But making it from givelite produces an aluminum and a zinc, which are fairly rare resources compared to silicon and nickel, which are easier to produce. So what this means is sapphirite chunks is our less desirable method. So we'll make that method number 5. And givelite chunks is slightly more desirable because of the aluminum and zinc. So we'll make that method number 6. And then we can produce iron from crushed givelite or crushed sapphirite. But we get 2 out of every 4 inputs, which is a reasonable efficiency. But givelite is the rarer resource, so it's probably less desirable to do that. So crushed givelite could be our number 7 method, and crushed sapphirite could be our number 8 method. We're starting to get fairly efficient here. The next way of producing iron is through ferrous mixtures and ferrous powder. Doing it through powder produces 3 iron, so 50% efficiency, with some manganese and nickel. Or doing it from the crushed mixture produces 2 iron and 2 manganese. So as far as iron production, they're both the same, where 50% of the input becomes iron. But the powder is slightly less desirable because it's producing a nickel every single time, which we're getting high enough onto the list now where we really don't want to be producing any byproducts. So if we only did the crushed mixture here, it would be 2 iron and 2 manganese, but then those 2 things can be combined to make just iron. So it would essentially be 100% efficient with no wasted resources, where this has the 1 nickel that's left over. So this is our less desirable method, so we'll make that method number 9. And then method 10 will be the crushed ferrous mixture. And then after that, the only way left to make it is from mineral catalysts, which is 100% efficiency. This is our desired method, and we'll make that method number 11. So how do we take all of these numbers and place them into these combinators so the system works? Well, you can just multiply that number that you determined. In this case, we have up to 11. You take that number and you multiply it by whatever increment you want to multiply it by. So let's say our increment is 2000, which is what I typically use. So for our least desirable method, crotinium chunks, that means if we have less than 2000 iron, this will run, and anything above it will also run because 2000 is less than more than 2000. And then our most desirable method which was the iron ore from catalyst, is method number 11. So that's if we have less than 22,000 iron, that will run, but only that. And basically this is a thought process that you need to go through for every single ore that you want to produce. Iron, copper, lead, tin, manganese, silicon, nickel, aluminum, zinc, and silver. Luckily, the rarer resources, like silver, are much easier to figure out because there's much less ways of making it. Like, you can only make silver from bobmodium, stearite, and the cupric powder. So that's much easier to calculate, but you probably don't want me going through all these numbers. Although I suppose I can post them up in the comments or something if someone's interested later. But I'll show them once it's all in place. But now that we have the method of calculating what these numbers should be, we can figure out how to set this up. So, to produce iron, we're going to have crushed sapphirite and givelite and the catalyst coming in. So the only thing that needs to control this is how much iron do we want. So let's say if iron is less than, well, the number we used, iron was method number 11, times 2,000 is 22,000. If iron is less than 22,000, send out a green square. And these combinators are completely unnecessary because the only output we have is iron, so we don't need these other combinators. And actually, we don't need any stop combinators either because the only output is iron. So if we have too much iron, it'll just get turned off using this one single combinator. It's much easier to do the logic this way. So we don't need any of these. And because the left and the right side are identical, we don't need this top line of combinators either. Get rid of all of them. We only just need this one combinator to control everything. And let's just use red wires because they're easier to see. And we don't need this these stop signal ones either. So get rid of those. So there we go. We have 6,000 iron on the signal coming in. 6,000 is less than 22,000, so those are both turned on, and these are enabled. So let's say we got 22,000. Let's say we had 30,000. What happens? Well, the 30,000 signal comes in. This is not less than 22,000, so it doesn't send the green signal, and it turns it off. And that's how we avoid having way too much of any particular resource. And since there's no slag, we don't need to pull off the slag. It can just go straight through. And since we don't have any slag yet, because there won't be any over there, it means we don't need this at all. Let's see, we can just make these belts nice and straight, because why not? That's one for the left side and one for the right side. And that's looking good. So our iron output produced from here will just be turned on and off very simply. You can kind of see why I built all this ahead of time, is because certain machines are much more complicated than others as far as the method of sorting everything out logically. So I wanted to do the most complicated method first, and then work our way down. But the iron goes through here, and the two belts will get bypassed, although we don't even need these sorting either, because we only have just the one type. So we don't need any of that stuff. And probably can make this look a little straighter. By doing something like this. So that's the iron output going straight through. But we also need to capture any iron that's already on the bus here. Since we're not placing anything on the bus, we can get rid of all of this. anything that's on the bus will get properly sorted and sent into the warehouse here. And then we will have our 8 belts of output. But by this point, there shouldn't be anything left. But we do want to have some storehouses here. I'm just using 2 storehouses because 4 plus 4 is 8. And it fits nice and conveniently in here. And have those there, just to capture any byproducts. And it doesn't need to have an alarm or anything, because these, under normal circumstances, should have nothing in them. And even if they have something in there, like let's say we, you know, we dropped a copper plate somewhere along the line. You know, we dropped some plates on there or something. Well, they go through, and now they're in here. So anytime we walk by and we see something inside the storehouse, we'll be like, that's weird. But if we see a copper plate, we'll be like, well, that wasn't a production issue. That was I dropped something somewhere, or my inventory got overloaded. Much more likely is you're going to find like biter souls in here, basically. These alien artifacts. That's much more likely. That you fought some biters, they got through the base, and you fought a bunch of biters, and they died on the bus. And then, you know, they go through getting processed like normal, and then they make it to the end. You're like, oh, well, okay. Then you just go about your day. Well, since this setup is much simpler, we can get rid of all of these undergrounds where we don't need to have them. And there we go. That should work. And for symmetry reasons, we can kind of put that one right there. Looks pretty good. Of course, in testing is when you find out if it's all messed up or not. But it's certainly a little more simplified than it was before. And that should be the setup necessary for handling iron. So now we need to do the same thing a couple of different times, because we have copper, lead, and tin all being produced in the same sort of way. So we can get by with the same logic for all of them. Now that we've discussed how the logic works, we need to configure it for each one of the different ore processing setups. But that's going to have to wait until the next episode. Thanks for watching, and I will see you later.